I'm very excited to introduce Sunil Khilnani, formerly the professor and director of the South Asia Studies program at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies here in D.C. He is now the Avantha Professor and Director of the India Institute at King's College London. His previous book, The Idea of India, was published to wide acclaim. In his new book, Incarnations, A History of India in 50 Lives, he recounts the broad sweep of Indian history through the lives of 50 extraordinary men and women who helped shape it. Incarnations is already garnering widespread acclaim. The Daily Telegraph wrote, "Incarnations makes the mind fly across time, place, and history. You may smile as, mentally, you walk along Khilnani up some flinty slope. You will keep thinking about what he said long after." So without further ado, please help me in welcoming him to Politics and Prose.
Thanks so much for that introduction, and thanks to all of you for coming out on this beautiful day when I'm sure you have many other more tempting things to do. In this book, I talk about the sweep of Indian history over about 2,500 years, and I do so, as you've just heard, through the stories of 50 individuals. Now, that's not an obvious way to talk about the history of India. And so, and one of the reasons I chose that was because I also want to tell a story about India's present and about its possible futures. And so what I thought I'd do for some minutes this afternoon is to set out for you my approach in the book and the context out of which it comes, and then tell you something about some of the bigger themes in the book and introduce you to some of the individuals whose stories I tell. History in any country is a form of capital. It's a resource that governments, political movements, academics all want to monopolize. And I think that's especially true in India, a relatively new nation created out of the only civilization in the world where all four great world religions have at different times ruled and collided. Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, Christianity. The competition amongst believers to control history struck me constantly as I traveled across India working on my book. And perhaps nowhere more vividly so than in an obscure, sleepy village in central India. In that village, which goes by the name of Sanati, there's a tiny temple dedicated to a Hindu goddess, Kalikamba. And some years ago, a huge storm smashed the roof over her head. When workers cleared the rubble, they flipped over the altar stone, and its center had been smashed out to hold the square pedestal on which the goddess stood. On the underside of that stone, were inscriptions in the ancient Brahmi script. And these were two rock edicts of the 3rd century emperor Ashoka, the famous follower of the Buddha who ruled over much of India. In later centuries, Brahmin priests had literally overturned that earlier history, repurposing Ashoka's stone as a base for their own deity. And Ashoka's message in this particular edict? It was an eloquent call for respecting those whose beliefs are different from your own. Now, even if Ashoka might not have, I think at least we can appreciate the irony. It's long frustrated me how the richness of Indian history gets flattened by and subordinated to collective belief, whether religious or ideological, as happened first with colonialism and later with nationalism. Myth and legend replace context and history. Complex individuals are born as cartoons, mythic heroic figures, and it becomes harder and harder to really grasp how contemporary India, one of the world's truly inventive democratic experiments and an emerging economic dynamo, how that came to be. So over the years, I started thinking about a different approach to explaining Indian history, one that would allow me to tell the fascinating stories of the men and women who made that history. I wanted to tell those stories in a form that was both nuanced and rigorous in its scholarship, but also humanly compelling, and perhaps even inspiring. For Indian collisions between multiple beliefs and traditions have brought forth, I think, some of human history's most interesting social, philosophical, and practical innovations and innovators, Gandhi with his creative nonviolence, to name an obvious one. And it seemed to me that the ideas of some of our other important thinkers, a Periyar or an Amrita Sher-Gill or an Ambedkar, to name three who figure in my book, are too important to be buried in scholasticism because they have a lot to contribute to some of the most urgent entrenched problems, not just in India today, but across the world. And that's what led me to embark on a very long journey across Indian cities and villages that became Incarnations, my book. It's a book that, starting with the Buddha, traces through 2,500 years of Indian history through these 50 lives. Scientists, philosophers, mathematicians, kings, artists, photographers, freedom fighters, industrialists, a second-century healer whose treatise on Ayurveda are still used to treat conditions from infertility to diabetes around the world today. The baby-faced monk Vivekananda, who effectively founded yoga while living in Manhattan in the 1890s, as it happens. And some of the names in my book are well known, but I think remain misunderstood, including, for instance, Vivekananda, who was actually a perceptive critic of many aspects of Hinduism, although today he's become something of a mascot for the Hindu right. Some of the stories that I tell are little known at all. I write about a plucky South Indian freedom fighter called Pillai, Chidambaram Pillai, who took on the might of the British shipping empire and was defeated, but it's a remarkable story. And nearly all of the stories I tell shine a light, I think, on conflicts that are still wrenching India today. And to tell these stories accurately, I explored new scholarship, archaeological discoveries, advances in understandings of Sanskrit science and art history, newly recovered documents. I just want to show you this one page. This is a page from Ramanujan's, what's called his Lost Notebook, which I looked at Trinity College in Cambridge, and you can see he's written from every possible angle. And also I drew upon declassified files in working on the essays in my book. And I drew them all of them, not just to bring precision to historical biography, but in order to puncture some of the stereotypes that are held about India. Stereotypes that reign not just in the mind of those outside India, but also in the minds of Indians themselves. In short, my feeling was that India is simply too important to the world to be so simplistically understood. And so I decided to demythologize Indian history a little in order to rehumanize it. Let's start with the first real individual whom we can find in Indian history, and that's Siddhartha Gautama, who became known as the Buddha. We think of him primarily as a beatific spiritual master, but as an icon, if you like, whose teachings, that are now followed by more than 1 billion people, were chiefly concerned with transcending the world of material attachments. But in the North India, where he was born sometime around the 4th century BC, he was also a political radical, envisaging an alternative society that was so threatening to the established order that even as his teachings spread across Asia and the world, they were virtually obliterated for centuries in the country of his own birth. Born to privilege, the Buddha undertook the great renunciation that's common in many Indian spiritual stories in order to seek enlightenment. And in achieving it, he laid out not just spiritual practices, but also revolutionary social ones. He and his followers rejected the rigid caste order upheld by Brahmins, and they enacted a series of unorthodox ideas for their times about the inclusion of women in worship, about the idea of shared property and collective decision-making, about the expansion of literacy to the lower castes, something that the Brahminic order forbade. He was, in other words, a threat to the reigning power structures. And so as Buddhism flourished in Tibet, in Japan, in Indonesia, in China, it was stamped out, sometimes violently, in his own Indian homelands by both Hindu and then later Muslim regimes. Which makes it even more striking that after long historical suppression, the Buddha erupts back into Indian history in the 20th century through the imaginative struggles of another misunderstood thinker that I write about, B.R. Ambedkar. He's the one in the blue suit there in the middle, a blue suit that he made fashionable all across India. Ambedkar was born himself an untouchable, as this former word was, and he was one of the architects of the Indian Constitution. And he turned ultimately to the Buddha as an example of worldly liberation from oppression. His unexpected political incarnation of the Buddha has made the ancient teacher an icon in the struggle against the caste system today. Take it from Vijay, a young friend I made in the slums in the course of researching this book. His family comes from a historically despised Dalit caste, untouchables in the language of old. But as Vijay explained to me, and these are his words, the Buddha had no caste, and so I have no caste. Buddha to Vijay represents caste equality. And so this is one way in which the Buddha has returned into contemporary Indian life, not as a remote spiritual figure offering enlightenment, but as a crucial, guiding, everyday historical presence with a liberating message for tens of millions of Indians and for the nation as a whole. Here's another stereotype of India, that it's a land of mystical traditions, remote from steely analytical thought. But in Mysore, South India, I got to hold in my hands a text from before the Common Era that contradicts that view. Inscribed on palm leaves, the manuscript was rediscovered at the beginning of the 20th century, and it proved that Indian thinking had, in the person of a man called Kautilya, a political mind that made Machiavelli, who lived some 1500 years after Kautilya, look gentle as a lamb. 2 millennia ago, Kautilya was counseling kings in the treacherous arts of what today we would call disinformation, surveillance, and covert ops. Here's just one sentence from what is an unnervingly ruthless strategic work, and Kautilya writes, "An arrow unleashed by an archer may kill a single man or not kill anyone, but a strategy unleashed by a wise man kills even those still in the womb." There's nothing mystical about Kautilya. Rather, he advocates guile, cunning, and deceit as essential to maintaining power. And today, his cutthroat advice has become a guide to corporate success in a competitive economy. His Baudelarized book has become a manual for aspiring entrepreneurs. And indeed, the Pakistani army, I'm told, even prescribes Kautilya to their trainee officers as a way of gaining insight into the devious Indian mind. But not many outside of India have heard of Kautilya, and even in India, few really study him. And so a really significant strain of Indian political thinking, not to mention a really good read, is exiled from its rightful position as a classic of international political thought. Another theme running through my book that's relevant to attempts to stifle free expression in India today. And it's worth just recalling that libraries have been burned over history that's deemed offensive, books have been pulped, scholars harassed. And as many of the life stories I set out make clear, what's driven India forward, made it stronger and less oppressive historically, has been the spirit of dissent. Rabble-rousers and critics who bravely took on their society and its customs have contributed, I think, far more than we like to acknowledge to India's contemporary incarnation as a global power. And they've also helped to drive significant social change. Take, for instance, the systematic oppressions and outright crimes committed against Indian women today. While they're a legitimate cause for despair and outrage, it's also important to note that conditions aren't uniformly dismal across the country. In the more progressive South, child marriage and fertility rates are much lower than in North India, and female literacy and employment rates are much higher. To point out that divergence isn't to suggest some deep cultural difference between North and South, but it's to recognize that inroads have been made by reform movements, amongst them one led by a school dropout from the South, a Tamil leader known as Periyar. And with his wild beard, he looks to me a bit like a beat poet, down to the little dog he kept by his side in order to scare off Brahmins. Now, Periyar was also an atheist and a rationalist, things that can get you killed in India today. But from the 1920s to the 1970s, he waged an intellectual campaign against upper caste northerners who he felt were dominating the national movement. He set himself up as the anti-Gandhi, so to counter Gandhi's habit of dressing in white, Periyar always wore black. And one of the things he pressed for was equality and greater freedom for women. For almost half a century, he advocated women's rights and unhindered access for women, for instance, to contraception in blunt fighting prose. And here's an example of how he spoke and wrote, and this is from one of his newspapers that he ran. Periyar says, "Have cats ever freed rats? Have foxes ever liberated goats or chickens? Have whites ever enriched Indians? Have Brahmins ever given non-Brahmins justice? We can say with confidence that women will never be emancipated by men." Women, he would say again and again, had to free themselves by their own personal and political action. And as I traced the rise of this whip-tongued reformer and the careers of other social disruptors that I write about in the book, I was struck again and again by a simple historical truth of how, under sustained and creative criticism, even rigid societies can actually change. Of course, the most celebrated and eccentric Indian reformer of modern times was Gandhi. He's often portrayed as a spiritual paragon, someone who transcends his historical moment. But in the story that I tell of his surprising rise to power, I hope to get you to see him with a bit more nuance, as an individual whose flaws and eccentricities were actually matched by some very modern strategic gifts. For one, he was a brilliant maker and exploiter of mass media images, someone who could have taught a lot of the corporate titans today a thing or two about branding. Gandhi's most famous act of nonviolent resistance was the Salt Satyagraha of 1930. This was a 200-mile march from his ashram down to the sea in the west of India. And its nominal goal was to pick up a handful of salt from the seashore, defying the British tax on this essential household good. Gandhi would often say afterwards that his idea for this march came to him in a sudden flash of inspiration. His inner voice told him to do it. But in fact, he planned for weeks the march, and he managed it with an uncanny grasp of the media as a political tool. The 79 marchers who accompanied him, well, each was chosen and vetted by Gandhi himself. No political colleagues were invited, lest they distract attention that he wanted centered on himself. The marchers' outfits, well, Gandhi designed all of them. He wanted no political insignia in order that the procession could convey a timeless, universal quality. He alone was allowed to carry a stick, ensuring his leadership would stand out. And the finishing touch was to dispatch an advance crew of his followers to whip up excitement amongst the villages he was going to be walking through, followed by the motor brigades of camera crews. Those camera crews from around the world, well, needless to say, Gandhi had invited them too. And so the jiggly footage of the Mahatma striding across the dusty plains, leading his band of followers, was imprinted on the imaginations of people around the world. The tiny stick man with teapot ears showing up the imperial blimps. Some months later, Time magazine would be drawing him for their cover, a cover in which he's shown reading a newspaper, reading perhaps of his own success at managing the media across the world. Now, to see Gandhi as a strategist that he was isn't, of course, to diminish him. It's to bring to life a leader who I think ranks beside a small handful of contemporaries who remade the modern world. But unlike a Stalin or a Hitler or a Mao, Gandhi won power through nonviolence, and his goals were infinitely different and required, as I tell in my book, real grit and nerve to achieve. Of all the stereotypes that Indians perhaps trade in when considering historical figures, some of the most damaging relate to women. Given the deep roots of Indian patriarchy, there are fewer historical records for significant females than there are for their male counterparts. And that absence of sources, I think, has tended to has played into a tendency to turn real women of intellection, of fallibility, and of bravery into goddess-type figures, figures that can be worshipped by women today, but not emulated. Consider the story of Lakshmi Bai, the Rani or Queen of Jhansi, who resisted the British during the uprising of 1857. This Jezebel Rani, as the British termed her, would be commemorated in Western Victorian adventure and romance novels as a tempestuous villainess. Meanwhile, most Indians know of her as a heroine frozen in a single dramatic image, astride a leaping horse, a sword raised high, her adopted son clinging to her back. And the British are about to conquer her fort, but instead of surrendering, she makes a bold midnight escape over the ramparts. And that's a statue just at the foot of her fort in Jhansi, of her in this pose. But as I looked down from the fort walls, from the very spot where she's supposed to have jumped, only one word came to my mind, and that was splat. And yet she's been stuck in this militant flying goddess version of history that, like the Western Jezebel tales, leave little room for the actual earthbound queen that she was. A woman struggling to rule over a kingdom that the British were trying to grab for themselves. So it's a relief to gain a more intimate sense of her from contemporary sources, which have only recently been fully translated. It turns out that she was strong of mind and body. Weightlifting, wrestling, and steeplechase were just her pre-breakfast routine. She was indifferent to regal trappings, in contrast to her cross-dressing husband. And she was so hands-on as a ruler that she punished criminals herself with the whack of a stick. But under pressure from the British, as I tell in my book, this anxious queen decided that rebels coming down from the north might help her hold on to her kingdom, a decision that, as it turned out, had tragic results for both sides. So as I narrate the story of a woman who took on the British and was killed by them, a further goal of mine is to bring back to the Indian past something it's decidedly short on, which is sophisticated, judgment-making female leaders, real individuals grappling with difficult conditions that today's young people might actually engage with. Another pernicious stereotype that traps the Indian imagination concerns race, and that's a subject I explore in one of my essays about an astoundingly successful and resourceful Ethiopian teenager who was shipped to India as a slave and who rose to become a power broker in the Deccan, in the central parts of India. Malik Ambar, you probably haven't heard that name, or most of you I don't think would have heard that name, is one of the remarkable historical figures who gets excluded from the pantheon because they don't fall into the conventional narrative silos of Indian history, Hindu, Muslim, or European. And traveling across India for my book, I heard many young Indians celebrate the bravery of Shivaji, who was a 17th century Hindu Maratha warrior who defied the Mughals, and he serves today as a symbol of Hindu pride and resistance to Mughal rule. But when I mentioned Malik Ambar, who beat back the Mughal expansion before Shivaji, eyes tended to go blank, which is a shame because this story is a really remarkable one of self-making. Malik Ambar was human chattel. He was shipped from Africa in exchange for Indian cloth. And that was part of a thriving but now little remembered slave traffic that sailed eastwards to India, as against the more well-known pattern from Africa west to North America. an indentured warrior, he quietly racked up a whole series of other skills, multiple languages, irrigation engineering, accounting amongst them. And before long, his master in the Deccan recognized him to be not just a brilliant fighter, but also a strategic thinker. And freed by that master on his deathbed, Malik Ambar quickly began to amass power of his own. Through guerrilla tactics and nighttime raids in this very treacherous Deccan landscape, the hilly landscape of the Deccan, the Ethiopian and his army of horsemen stopped the southward thrust of the Mughal Emperor Akbar and his son Jahangir. And ultimately, Malik Ambar gained control over large parts of the Deccan. In fact, he became such a nemesis of the Mughals that the Emperor Jahangir took to commissioning gruesome miniature paintings like this one, in which he beheaded the Ethiopian on paper. It's actually fantasy, because the emperor failed again and again to achieve that in real life. Jahangir, though, might have been happy with, had he been able to foresee the future, because that has secured the elimination largely of Malik Ambar from Indian history. Malik Ambar wasn't a Hindu native defending some ancient motherland. He was an African outsider, and thereby destined to be forgotten in a society that still has deep prejudices against people of dark skin color. Indeed, descendants of African slaves like him now live poor and ghettoized mainly in the western state of Gujarat. And it's maddening that children growing up in those shunned communities won't find any mention in their school books of a self-made power entrepreneur whose skin color and lineage they share. Now, occasionally in the slum or village lanes, as I researched Incarnations, I overheard teenagers explaining to their friends what I was up to. It went along the lines of, he's telling the story of how India became number one. Now, indeed, it's a habit of national histories to justify the present as the perfect and necessary outcome of what came before. But as I worked on this book, I was struck again and again by how many of these 50 individuals I write about posed, like Malik Ambar, really sharp challenges to the Indian present. Through religious collisions, philosophical encounters, and moral experiments, these individuals were part of arguments that have been kept going for millennia about what kind of life is worth living, about what kind of society is worth having, which hierarchies are morally legitimate, what role religion has in the social and legal order, what kind of love is valid, who owns the water and the land, and what kind of place India should be. A civilization able to produce a Buddha and a Mirabai, a Phule, a Gandhi, a Dhirubhai Ambani, that civilization is open to radical experiments with self-definition, and I think to productive arguments about what a country and its people should value. And such diverse energy is worth celebrating, especially at a time when religious nationalists in India want to transform the multiplicity of ideas of creative self-criticism and dissidence into a more singular ideological brew. So I'm arguing for a version of history that creates options for the future instead of foreclosing them. A rich history that expands in the world's store of available ideas and ideals. After all, it's not just Indians who have a stake in a country where 1/5 of humanity resides. Keeping India's future open enlarges the world. Thank you.
Ready to take questions? If anybody, just remember to step up to one of the two microphones if you'd like to ask a question.
Do you mind if I ask two?
Sure.
Okay, the first.
As long as no one else minds.
No. The first question is, you've mentioned leadership in the south as well as to the west. I'm curious about the eastern part of India. Do you see more representation coming from the west, meaning northwest, the Punjab, all the way down to Tamil? Or do you see also heroic figures, leadership emerging in the east?
Yeah, well, thank you. I mean, that's an interesting question because it allows me to say a bit about, how I selected some of these figures. And I certainly have a number of figures from the East and many from the North as well. I do have quite a lot from the South because that often tends to get actually written about. From the East, of course, Bengal is a very important source for a number of reasons. So I've tried to have figures from all parts of the subcontinent. But it wasn't, I wasn't explicitly trying to get, X number of people from each place. That wasn't a calculation that I was really interested in. And there is one area that I actually haven't been able to really say enough about in terms of individuals from those parts, and that's the Northeast. The large part explanation for that is that I found it very difficult to get good sources for figures from that part of the country for earlier parts of Indian history. You could get information about kingdoms and some of the sort of broad cultural formations, but it was very hard to identify individuals for whom you had particular sources. So that was a constraint I faced with the Northeast. But otherwise, I think, there's a map in the book which shows the birthplaces of most of these figures. And it's fairly evenly distributed, I think.
Okay, quick second question, and it's about regarding censorship. Last night, in a discussion with Salman Rushdie in the National Book Festival, there was some dialogue about Modi's current leadership and a concern about the focus on Hindu religion and what you earlier had talked about, arguing for pluralism. Is your book going to be released in India, or has it been already? And are there any concerns in your mind about political censorship in terms of authors like yourself?
Yeah, no, my book is out in India. It came out at the same time as it came out in the UK. And it was, very generously received. I think that the censorship issue often in India is not so much a state censorship issue. It's often a kind of social censorship which gets exercised, where there are groups in society who claim to be offended by a particular piece of writing or theater or film or whatever it might be, who then tend to exercise pressure either on the legal process or on government officials to sort of take action. So there is certainly, the presence of that. But India, we're an open society, and these are battles that are going on. There have been battles that have been going on. The way India won freedom was against a regime that actually did impose state censorship. There are, very interesting books that list all the publications that were banned during the British era, including Gandhi and so on. So, the struggle for widening the arena of free expression is a long-standing one in India. It's not a new one. And I think this is a moment where there are, again, pressures running one way or the other, many of them coming from society itself. But this is an ongoing battle. The courts play a role in it, but so does political leadership. And the emergency was another moment in the mid-1970s when constitutional liberties were suspended and the free press was closed down. But I'm basically very optimistic about the continued expansion of the ability to express freely what you think. That's for me has been the lifeblood of Indian history and thought. That's one of the things I wanted to affirm in this book. And so, yeah, that's broadly my view.
Thank you.
I'm very much enjoying reading Incarnations, and thank you very much for your talk, and thank you very much for your words today. What decisions by early prime ministers of India and various leaders would you say has most impacted contemporary society in India, and why?
Gosh, Okay, well, that's a big question, and it's certainly a question that there'd be no universal agreement over how one answered it. I mean, I think, the underlying the point you're making, which is the role of leadership and what has been that in the creation of modern India. I think that is an important point to underline. And I think the foundations of India in the late 40s and the early 50s, it was a process rather than a moment. I think that extended for some years, if not decades, were very important, and they laid a kind of groundwork for basically a constitutional, democratic, open society, which is being built on today. And it's worth underlining the stability of that, because many new nations' constitutions didn't last. They collapsed after a few years, or they were put in place very late. The Indian constitution is actually now older than the current French constitution, so it's worth remembering that. And that has given a certain stability, so that even when there may be changes of leadership, there's a certain continuity about the kind of society that we're engaged in building in India. So more than and then one can argue about the role of different individual prime ministers, but I think that's a more detailed argument. But I just want to emphasize that initial choice of leadership about creating this order, which has been sustained. Of course, Prime Minister Nehru played a very important role. Indira Gandhi, who's extremely controversial, was responsible for the emergency. She's also been has many important achievements. Prime Minister like Narasimha Rao in the 1990s, who introduced or worked with the then later Prime Minister Manmohan Singh to bring about economic reforms in India. So there are different moments that one would choose as important staging points. But thank you. I'm glad you're enjoying the book.
Sunil?
Yes.
You ended your remarks saying that you hope that your book, putting together all these different strands in Indian thought and politics, would sort of be presage the future. I wanted to ask you, while this is a very complicated question to answer, but as you do look at the various challenges, which are many, that India faces, a still very large and growing population, pollution, which gets more aggravated even as progress occurs, and then the larger framework of China, other competitive forces. Are you optimistic? What do you see as going forward?
There are huge challenges. I mean, there are vast challenges. But again, these have not suddenly been discovered by it. I mean, India has been facing challenges right from. I mean, the very moment of independence for India, when it proclaimed itself as a constitutional democratic state, that was seen as a kind of impossibility. This was not going to hold together. If you look at the writing immediately afterwards, all the predictions were that India was going to fall apart and secede. Bits were going to secede, and that Pakistan was going to be the real success story because it was the more homogeneous and more kind of a singular religion. So I'm simply saying that to say that big challenges have always been part of what Indian history has faced. They are particularly large at the moment, but broadly, to answer your question, yes, I am optimistic. I mean, I think that there are, and I'm optimistic above all because I think that now, we have 70 years almost of an open society in India, for all the pressures that are there, and there are pressures as in any society against expression and so on, but it is essentially an open society. And now you are also starting to see really significant economic change and growth. And if you combine those two things together, the capacity to think openly, freely, and inventively with the sort of entrepreneurial energies that are emerging in India. I think that's a very powerful combination. That's a combination that in your own country here has been enormously effective. So I think those trends, if you like, or those forces, for me, are a source of real optimism.
And what about China? I mean, is that a potential ally or a potential rival?
Well, this is. I mean, that's. I think reading what China's intentions are is something that no state in the world has figured out. It's not just Nehru in 1962 who didn't figure that out. I think it's a conundrum that people in this city are trying to work out. I think the Chinese themselves don't even really know what to do with all the power they've suddenly acquired. So this is it hasn't happened in human history for a state so quickly to acquire so much power, financially, militarily, etc. So this is a puzzle for all of us, and it's certainly a very, very big challenge for India. There's no question about it, because India shares the largest land border it has with China, and it's navigating that is going to be one of the challenges of diplomatic skill, but also of the kind of economic growth, military calculations, and others that Indian leaders and governments and Indian public opinion as well has to sort of deal with in coming years.
Hi, thank you so much for coming here to speak. I'm not sure how often audiences in Washington get to hear from you these days, but it's a pleasure. My question is a little more open, but since you say that India is an open society, I figure I can ask an open question.
Go for it.
In grappling with India in this particular way, and you've touched on this, I'm sure, in your previous book, Idea of India, you think about what holds India together, what's arbitrary about India, because when you examine Buddha or even Periyar or Mirabai or people like that, they're not in India per se. They live in past societies that existed on the subcontinent. In grappling with that, pursuing this book, what have you learned about India as a concept that maybe didn't make it into your first book?
Gosh, that's an interesting question. I learned a lot. I mean, one of my earlier book that you referred to was really looking at the foundations of modern India, more on the 20th century. I mean, this book really stretched me in terms of having to go back into areas that I was having to skate very fast on the ice. So I just at a purely personal level, it was a kind of, if you like, a journey of self-education. I mean, learning about archaeology or Sanskrit science and philosophy. So that was very educative. What it also brought home to me was the depth of these examples of people struggling with and arguing with the social moments and structures that they existed in and with. This energy of kind of being critical, self-critical, in order to kind of try and change things. And I think that was, when you think of figures from the Indian past, for example, in the nationalist pantheon or religious saints or whatever, you think of them as these venerable old figures with long white beards. Some of, indeed they do have long white, but you think of them as these very staid figures. What struck me looking at these figures, these were all young, critical, dissenting rabble-rousers most of the time, right? Trying to stir things up. So whether it was a Basava in today's Karnataka, or indeed a Periyar, or a Guru Nanak, or a Kabir, or a Mirabai, or a Phule, these were all figures who were young people, and I mentioned that because, of course, today India is a young society. Above all, it's a young society. And so I wanted partly to say, look, I mean, there is, these may be distant in history, as you say. They're not in India today. But I'll come back to that in a second. But to say to young Indians in India, but also elsewhere, and to non-Indians too, there is this lineage, if you like, or there is these resources for thinking imaginatively about how to make your society today. But one of the reasons why the book is called Incarnations is because a lot of the figures that I talk about, most of them, I'm interested in their afterlives as well. So the way in which they are used in contemporary Indian political debate and argument. The Buddha, of course, is a prime example of that. But very many of these other figures as well are still alive in Indian debate today. And that was a way in which I think it's not just that they exist in the remote past. Actually, for example, even in that photograph I showed earlier of Vijay in the Buddhist temple in Islam, 4 of the figures in the photograph, there was Buddha, there was Ambedkar, there was Phule and Shivaji. Now these are all from back in history, but they're very present in the contemporary imagination, and I write about all 4 of those in the book. So that was one thing I wanted to bring out too.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
I think we'll call this the last question.
Gandhi, of course, was a migrant to South Africa. What about the Indian diaspora around the world? Almost certainly it will grow, and in some ways it may be much like the European or Anglophone diaspora. How will that transform India, and in turn, how will the Indian diaspora transform the world?
Well, that's the diaspora is here to answer that. But that does allow me to thank you for that question, because it does allow me to bring out one aspect that's important in the book, which is that it's very much, I'm very interested in the global connections between India and the world. I mean, one of the things I'm trying to get away from in the book is the idea that India is this hermetically sealed society and has been for centuries. On the contrary, beginning with the Buddha himself, I mean, India is connected to other things happening across the world, and people are moving back and forth. So I talk about Malik Ambar coming into India, but again, Indian ideas, Indian goods. I talk about the Cholas in the south who have seafaring connections. And then also, again, even if you think about Indian capitalism today, its globalized ambitions are not new. I talk about Jamsetji Tata, who's the founder of the Tata Empire. And this was a family with connections in China, in Africa, in England, benefiting from the Civil War in America, which cut off cotton supplies, which allowed them to expand their cotton industry in India. So the globalization of India, culturally, socially, economically, is a long-standing process. Of course, it intensifies, and it has different rhythms, and it's more intense today, perhaps. But it's been there for a long time. In terms of the diaspora itself, I mean, this is of course, a very significant force. But your invitation to speculate on its future role, I don't know. I mean, I think it's already playing a very, significant, has made a significant impact in this country, and that doesn't look like stopping soon. So.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much for coming out.